For everyone with an interest in NASH, or more broadly, fatty liver disease, Surf's Up, Season 3, Episode 47 of Surfing the NASH Tsunami. Our look at what's on the horizon for Nashville in the next 6 months starts now.
This week on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
The next month is going to produce so much exciting data that we're really entering the discussion with the colleagues of which of my patients should receive treatment. And that's where we revisit this theme of identify them easy, cheap, and select them and send them to us for future treatment.
You have 4 different mode of action pathways that seem capable of making a contribution. So ideas like combination drug therapy, matching the right drug to the right patient, all those things become realistic and promising. That, I think, is far more than anybody would have hoped for 6 months ago.
A drug that's going to be managed on £29,000, £30,000 or £40,000 a year, that incentivizes a GP, primary care, and the entire networks to say, you must add this test to the blood that you're drawing. That pushes the right buttons for people to start to take notice.
Is that what we call a perverse incentive?
It is definitely what I think we call a perverse incentive.
I think we're going to see positive phase 3 data emerging. The whole momentum, the discussions with the regulators is going to be at the heart of, getting an FDA-approved drug. So that's something for me very exciting, because it's going to then, as we've discussed numerous times, change the math and the dynamics and provide us with more opportunities to serve these patients and provide liver health.
Every week, a global community of fatty liver disease stakeholders comes together to explore the most important challenges in diagnosing, treating, and developing medications for patients with fatty liver diseases. Join our regular surfers, hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Professor Jörn Schattenberg, liver wellness advocate Louise Campbell, and pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green, as they take out their crystal balls to consider the next several months of life in Nashville, this week on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
So I'm really happy about today's episode because it's just Louise and Jörn and me, and the 3 of us have not been an episode by ourselves for a while. In fact, the 3 of us haven't even been on an episode together, forget alone together, except for the one right after Paris Nash. We've not been on the same episode together for over a month. So I'm just delighted to have you folks with us. I think it's exciting to have us with us the night after the England-Germany soccer game, or football match, if you will, because it means that the people talking trash will not be Louise and me, but might be Louise and Jörn. Louise, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And it was a stalemate, so Jörn and I are just neutral parties on this one now.
Actually, it was a stalemate because the defenses were both so stale. So I think there's a double entendre somewhere in that one. And Jörn, how are you feeling?
I'm good, thank you. And I think the game tied, right? I didn't even follow it closely, I have to say. But
yeah, 3-3.
Up here now.
England only appeared for 20 minutes and scored 3.
Yeah. Gary Lineker, the English announcer, actually not announcer of that match, but announcer, tweeted right after Kane's penalty kick, "We've scored 13 goals in 3 minutes. We are the most informed team in the world. How can we lose?" And then, of course, you gave up one more goal and you drew. Okay, I think that's probably enough football for today.
Otherwise, I'm fine. I mean, there's been a lot of traveling, a lot of activities, and that's always draining. And because it's good to be back and in contact with colleagues, exchange, but it also takes some energy off you.
So just for everybody who has not been keeping track, in the last 3 weeks, we've had Paris Nash, then we had the NAFLD Summit in Dublin, and then we had EASD in Stockholm, which Jörn attended and we didn't, and a British Liver Trust meeting, which we did not attend, but maybe grabbing highlights from in some later week. Tomorrow, there's this important meeting with NICE that is of tremendous import to Louise, and all kinds of other stuff going on at once. So today, all we're going to do is we're going to take 4 or 5 topic areas and discuss things that might happen in the next 6 months that are of interest to the community. In 6 months, we will probably come back, look at this episode, and figure out how good or bad we are at prognostication. I figure if there's no danger, it's no fun. So that will be our danger as we will grade ourselves 6 months hence. But with that, let's just get started.
Yeah, to say something on the safe side, Roger, I realized I have 12 weeks to get all my Christmas presents. That's really around the corner now. And I think there's a lot of data coming up to be expected until then. So there's really not a lot of time.
Unless you want to view in the professional context those data points as being your prospective Christmas, or in my case, Hanukkah presents. And our people, we get them over 8 nights. So in fact, if the data come on different days, it's completely consistent with the Jewish tradition. profession. It's all good. So personal, professional, one good thing that's happened in the past week, everyone's got courage here. Whoever's got the most courage, go first.
Yeah, for me professionally, it's been successful attending those meetings and being able to exchange. And personally, of course, coming back home and spending some time with the family over the weekend before then heading back to work has been a highlight. Nothing could single out, but it's been an exciting few weeks.
Oh, I spent a nice weekend in the Lake District, doing a bit of Hadrian's Wall and walking the lakes for a while, getting a lot of steps in, not eating so much healthily because it started with a Michelin star restaurant, but I did get the steps in to equal out. That was a highlight for me because I haven't been there for a long time and my husband's never been there. It was a nice bit to do.
Okay. Louise, you're the one who's educated me that you can get in steps to deal with the calories, but you can't deal with your liver simply by getting in steps. So I'm hoping that you are either attentive or you'll scan yourself in the near future and make sure you didn't do too much damage in the course of the weekend. I am talking as we come to the end of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, which is always a good time for reflection and prayer, which is good. Professionally, not to get cocky here, and we'll come back to this in a minute, but we're closing in on 100,000 downloads for this podcast. We will get there sometime in the month of October, and that's happened because we've maintained a nice brisk pace over the weeks that didn't have meetings, and we'll go back over 2,000 again this week. That's usually business report stuff, but the 100,000 is an exciting idea, and so I feel pretty good about that. With that, why don't we move into our second groundbreaker, which is over the next 6 months, one thing each of us can envision happening that has the potential to dramatically shift the force around fatty liver disease. We're going to talk about lots of things in the next hour, but let's just pick one to start that's noteworthy. Go ahead, Jörn.
Yeah, let me step back 1 minute and just recap on the meetings we had. It ended with the European Association for the Study of Diabetes in Stockholm, where for the first time as a hepatologist I attended. And for me, this was, of course, a groundbreaking moment, but I think a lot of hepatologists are considering this is really the place where we got to go to educate our peers and highlight that in addition to the complex comorbidity situation, a patient living with type 2 diabetes, that means they're suffering from kidney, heart, neurovascular problems. There's the liver that needs to be tended for. And our field has matured and generated enough data to say we have straightforward and simple tools that you can integrate in your existence care of patients with type 2 diabetes to provide a more holistic or a more complete approach to health and include liver health in the regular type 2 diabetes checkup. If I take those three meetings together, Paris-NASH, the NAFLD Summit, and then EASAD, this is just emerging with so much force, this concept, that it's here to stay, and we're ready to discuss which patients need care most urgently from a hepatologist perspective.
Grand convergence was one of my themes that I wanted to make sure we got to today, and that's a great lead into that conversation because that's exactly what the point of it is. Louise, something in the next 6 months you think is important?
Well, I've got the same sense as Jörn, certainly from Paris and Dublin, that we are seeing more of a convergence with endocrinology and comorbidity management and certainly detection. That's fantastic news, and I can only see that strengthening, although I think it will be a slow burner. The one that's not really joining us at the table is cardiology at the moment and cardiovascular disease. Maybe those are the next conferences that Jörn and the other leads have to go for that one, but it'll be interesting. But I do get the sense that we're heading in that direction, and there are weaknesses and strengths that I've seen. Obviously, still the lack of nursing and lack of patient involvement in some of these sessions going forward. Without either of those being involved, we're not really going to trigger. So that's what I want to see, and that's what I would like to see more of during the upcoming meetings for the rest of the year. ARSLD, NASH-TAG, things like that at the beginning of next year, that we start to strengthen those bonds, because we've said before, and it has been commented on, that one of the biggest workforces is nursing and allied health, and this is one of the biggest diseases, if not arguably the biggest disease in the world. So I think Jörn's right. I think we are getting more endocrinology input. I think we're there to stay, and I'd love to hear his feedback as to how you were received as a hepatology in an endocrine field, because we always embrace Ken Kuzi when he comes on, so I'd like to see whether they embraced you with the same furry gloves and cuddles that we give Ken.
So, digression, and then we will come back to that, which is that Scott Isaacs mentioned on the most recent episode of the Diabetes podcast that he has now joined AASLD, which he believed might have made him the second endocrinologist in AASLD after Ken, but now it's a trap. There are at least two of them, and gathering momentum from that direction as well. I want to talk about energy formation using a different definition of energy in a different sense, which is we've all seen the exciting and positive clinical trials that have surfaced in the last 3-4 weeks, and we'll be talking about that on this podcast too. But Akero filed for $230 million in and equity to help get through their phase 3 trial and get to market based on their 2B results. If they can get that one done at a reasonable value in an economy that's dicey to tightening in most of the world, I think it will signify that the financial markets are turning back towards some optimism about this drug class. And if they are, and either obeticholic acid or resmetirom then goes on to get approved, as I think most of us expect will happen for at least one, we will have investment from private sector to back up all the energy and all the convergence and the excitement that you two just talked about. And when you've got people having increased passion to do the right thing and the funding to do it, you can build momentum really quickly. Now, that's not measured in weeks, maybe not even in months, more like years, but in years and not decades. So I think this is potentially a really exciting time for all those reasons. Everybody's coming to the same place. With that, Jörn, let's go back to the meetings of the past 3 weeks that we've never talked about together, except a little bit Paris-Nash, the three of us. And what do we think were the most important things that came out of them, besides increasing signs of convergence? Were there specific papers, presentations, concepts that you thought were particularly helpful as we look forward?
Roger, I think you discussed some of them already in this podcast. So without being too redundant, I'd like to focus on ESAD again and pick up where Louise left her last question, which is how was this concept that liver disease is part of the multimorbidity management in patients living with type 2 diabetes being received by these peers. And there was a strong interest there because, again, those endocrinologists are used to managing comorbidities and we give them simple tools. Now, we've discussed all the pitfalls of the FIB4, which doesn't capture all advanced disease cases, but it will identify a relevant subset of patients that do need follow-up. And I had a lot of one-on-one discussions after the presentation I gave on how this could potentially be implemented, highlighting that lab systems could automatically report FIB4 if you calculate 3 penny lab values in the end, AST, ALT, and platelets, adding on age, and then you end up with identifying those patients. And the second question is, well, where's the hepatologist that I can send these to? That's where we got to build more momentum and maybe even intersect allied health professionals to not have these patients being lost in the system. But from endocrinologists' perspective, the ones I talk to and the ones that then come up to me, that's not maybe representative of the entire field, but for sure there's a big interest and there's much more, let's call it ground root talk about which liver function tests I need, how can I do this in my practice, and that's simple compared to hepatologists. We're very focused on improving the numbers or increasing negative predictive values and so on. In the field of endocrinologists, we're entering at a whole different level where there's not as much knowledge and they're very open to include these metrics in their care and then start providing liver health.
That's interesting. Very interesting to me. Quentin produced a paper in Dublin that I thought was very, I guess the British would call it clever, in terms of thinking about the statistics of NPVs and PPVs in a different way than we have historically. And his point was dead on, which is that if you think about the statistics of predictive values, any equation will be managed to solve for the bigger case. So if you're dealing with a population that's 80% negative, 20% positive, you will set different values for a test than you would if you were dealing with a population that's 50% negative and 50% positive. Quentin's point, and I'm going to overstate slightly, and Quentin, if you hear this and I'm wrong, please forgive me, write in and or send me a flame or email and we'll figure out how to get it cleaned up, was that because the test is for the patients who are at risk of fibrosis, and that's only 10-15% of the population, 20% if you go to diabetics, for example, that any first test NPV will matter far more than PPV, and you should assign values accordingly. If you wipe out a significant portion of people who are not sick, by the second test you might be at 50-50, and then PPV will definitely be higher, because whatever test you use, you'll be evaluating a different population. Point being, it makes less sense to worry about what the perfect first or second test is, and to understand the underlying dynamic of the statistics and to use the two tests appropriately. And the reason that matters to me in the context of what you just said is exactly what you just said, which is endos simply want to know what to do first. And a bunch of tests might be good enough for what to do first, although FIB4 is the one that's dirt cheap and becoming most readily accepted. But for a second test, that gets into the hands of hepatologists who might focus more on what the best option is. But also now we're looking for an option that we're measuring based on its ability to get PPV high as compared to merely get NPV high. There's a logic in terms terms of how to use tests that will flow with what happens on a clinical care pathway. And I thought Quentin's paper pointed that up nicely. And I'm hoping that people are going to look a lot more at that going forward.
It absolutely makes sense. There are multiple hurdles in the way. One of them is most areas, certainly in the UK, don't do all of the blood tests that are required for FIB4, and whether or not we have to come back to an algorithm in healthcare that detects most diseases. And therefore, we're finding disease early, or the highest risk stratification early. And there will be a set for cardiac, there will be a set for endocrine. So combining the common strengths and saying that all bloods should include X, Y, and Z, and covering the biggest amount of bases so that there's less holes in your net, I suppose, if you were catching fish. The other thing, particularly in endocrinology, and the evidence seems to be there from Arnold, is that the higher the BMI and the greater the risk of type 2 diabetes, the less some of the biomarkers work. So it is about looking for the right tests, but it's also looking for the right tests in the right population and how we envisage them, because what we don't want is a high negative predictor in somebody with a BMI of over 40 who's got type 2 diabetes, because actually that's what we're going to find if we look at the blood values of FIB4 and from my knowledge. So we already know that a lot of people feel safe if they've got normal liver function tests with their patient, and we know that's incorrect, and vice versa. It is a difficult one to say which one do you do first, which one do you do second, when do you do them? For me, it would be picking up these diseases or the risks before they develop the disease, when these tests are going to be most accurate in a biomarker format. But that's just the way I align and think from wellness rather than necessarily always about illness, because to be on what we discuss, you've already got to be a patient. With a silent disease, the majority of patients with NAFLD and NASH are still silent until they get cancer and different mechanisms. Those are hurdles we've got to come across in the best way possible for patients. So it is education, but it's education of everywhere. And I think when we did our fatty liver clinics, it was a hepatologist and a FibroScan team that sat in our endocrine clinics in real time and did that. It would be nice to see a hepatologist, an endocrine consultant in a big hepatology clinic, because that would add, certainly to my knowledge when I was sitting in there, of HbA1c, how it was affecting how we better manage. Where we place the physicians, it could be either or and both. We always have nurse specialists within some of those clinics. There's lots of opportunities, but I think there are hurdles with some of the tests that we've got, particularly in the diabetes population that we're looking at.
Louise, let me ask you a question. The ACE guidelines, which were promoted last May, make it very, very clear that for diabetic patients, the recommendation is don't even think about NAFLD, assume everybody has it. And the only goal is to figure out who's fibrotic and who's fibrotic at who's F2 or higher, really. How do you envision that message playing through the system? Well, do you? And if so, how do you envision playing through the system in practical terms in the next 6, 12, 24 months? And then, Jörn, I'm going to ask you exactly the same question.
I think it depends what happens in everybody's healthcare system. We've obviously got NICE going through at the moment, accessing FibroScan for primary care, which is one area you could use it, particularly if you've already got a FIB4 or you've got a diabetic population. There's evidence from Arnold, I can't remember the name of the author, who was suggesting that actually you do FibroScan before in that population, because you will pick up more people because of the disparity in the blood tests as the BMI rises in that population. So it depends on your pathway. Going back to the question originally, most physicians don't necessarily do AST and ALT, which means FIB4 and other tests ratio can't be used. We do have to standardise tests to get the biggest uptake. For me, that's where we need to start. Yes, we can assume everybody's got fatty liver. The problem is most people don't think their population has fatty liver, because if that was the case, it would be addressed in primary care. So people don't see that population. We do. We know that around about 69 to 80% of patients with type 2 diabetes will have fatty liver disease, but 30% can be metabolically fit of people who live with obesity, for example. So being one size fits all is not. So we do have to find the better tests we do have to look at, but we have to start with being able to do the tests routinely across healthcare and not just assume it happens, because lots of people don't do those tests. Even here, up to 75% of primary care do not do ALT and AST as a routine test. So therefore, we couldn't even include FIB4.
Okay, so Louise, one quick follow-up. Sorry, Jörn. Probability answer. What is the probability that over the next year, British Liver Trust, ACE guidelines, everything else that's converging will lead to an increased use of FIB4 or the test necessary to conduct FIB4 at primary care in the UK? If I put a gun to your head, what would the answer? This is the week in Jewish lore when you were written in the Book of Life or the Book of Death. Okay, stay alive. What's the answer?
I think very little will change because each individual area doesn't see liver health as a priority. It doesn't actually look at it. They'll just see it as a cost and the cost to the test. So I know we want it, but I think most people will still see it as a cost that they're not prepared to bear because they don't understand or appreciate the actual size of the burden that we are talking about. So I don't think a lot will happen.
So Jörn, what does that dynamic look like today and going forward in the rest of Europe, for example, where I know you're doing a lot of public health work, or even in the US as you see it?
I'm aligned with Louise that these tests are not necessarily all done in the cases where we would want them in order to identify these patients. But that's why I'm so excited to go and actually speak with my endocrinologist, because I have simple tools now that I can highlight. That's the way forward to do this. And Louise rightfully mentioned, or highlighted, we're not detecting steatosis now, which is a metabolic risk factor, which carries implications, which means you can empower your patient to change things. This would be more complex. I think for a start, albeit imperfect, I would favor to identify the advanced cases to be able to then link them to care in terms of potentially either lifestyle, but in the future drugs, of course. The public health system in Europe is very dependent on which country you operate on. Louise mentioned the UK. In Germany, there's a lot of individual physicians prescriber freedom. They will do whatever they want. And to really convince them and change their behavior, you need to do CMEs with them. You got to go out and educate them in meetings. And I think that's what the last 3 meetings was all about. And that's why I highlighted that as an excitement. There's not going to be a top-down dictate of you have to do FIB4. The only way it can be established, I think, is through going ground roots here, educating peers and really convincing them that this is something that identifies relevant patients. It's also linked to outcome. Now, we don't even want that test to be an outcome predictor, but it's strong enough and we have enough data to even link it to outcome. So this is another argument for physicians to actually identify these patients because they do worse. And then I think it's justified to suggest them for intensified management.
That makes sense. Of everything I've seen on this in the last 6 months, I think the most compelling case for FIB4 in primary care is the one you just alluded to, which is that it is prognostic of all-cause mortality and of cardiovascular mortality, and it's prognostic of those even if you take age out, because obviously FIB4 is responsive to age and that's a factor. But if you take age out and simply look at the rest of the FIB4 calculation, it has independent prognostic value, which would be an argument that goes primary care wants to look at that to understand in the metabolic mix how much risk their patients are at, in addition to simply whether they've got liver fibrosis or not.
The thing that will really shift the paradigm to doing a lot more of these tests and making them routine is the minute we have a drug available. If we look at obeticholic acid, the average cost, I believe, for somebody with PBC who gets access to it is around about £29,000. Now, that is a 10 milligram dose. Now, if we look at going through the NASH pathway, that is a 25 milligram dose. Will they keep that in the same price range? Will they increase it? But the minute you have a patient needing a drug that's going to be managed on £29,000, £30,000 or £40,000 a year, that incentivizes a GP, primary care, and the entire networks to say, you must add this test to the blood that you're drawing. Because by picking up early detection, we will then avoid the majority of patients needing obeticholic acid, resmetirom, and the next one's through. So I think whilst I'm not a great fan of we need a very expensive drug to start doing what we should be doing, which is screening, what I am a fan of is that pushes the right buttons for people to start to take notice.
Is that what we call a perverse incentive?
It is definitely what I think we call a perverse incentive, because we all know that most healthcare systems around the world react to illness. They do not go for prevention. And looking at prevention now while you're reacting to illness, particularly post-COVID, means they've got a double whammy, if not a triple whammy of expenses. You're the statistician. Mm-hmm. So yeah. It's a shame, but that it is perverse.
You get perverse incentives of unintended consequences and the paradox of choice all into one bundle there if you want to look at it. Go ahead.
Just to follow up quickly, I mean, the price can't possibly in the same range, right? So we're talking about an orphan disease and drug range, but it's still probably not going to come for free. And I think it replicates what you said. I mean, there's going to be the incentive, even if it's not the same numbers here. And of course, the availability of a drug is, in my view, around the corner. And maybe that segues us to the next section without wanting to hijack your moderator skills here, Roger. The next month is going to produce so much exciting data that we're really entering the discussion with the colleagues of which of my patients should receive treatment. And that's where we revisit this theme of identify them easy, cheap, and select them and send them to us for future treatment.
First of all, this is another one of those you beat me to it by 30 seconds, which is great. It shows that we're all rubbing off on each other in positive ways. I think that's right. A bolus of positive data will change how people think about what's coming. I remember that before obeticholic acid got their complete response letter in 2020, that they were starting to do education at lots of major meetings. But their education was mostly on bridging fibrosis and cirrhosis. We probably want to think about catching people earlier. If we're going to get 2 or 3 drugs with different profiles in terms of where their benefits are in metabolic disease and their level and nature of toxicities, then I think that's right. We'll have a lot more motivation to test because we can do something about it. All these doctors now who say, why am I testing? I can't do anything, because they figure diet and exercise fails 9 times out of 10 and they don't want that level of futility with nothing behind it. Well, now they have something they can do, right? So I agree that that's right. I'll tell you, Jörn, I mentioned this is my big feature. I was heartened by the amount of money that Akero went out for. That's a big number. And it's a big enough number that says they believe that in addition to the excellence in their data, there's enough optimism coming from other places that makes their data more credible. If you show up with one amazingly pretty flower in a garden of weeds, the flower gets lost and people wonder whether it's an optical illusion or whether the weeds will kill it. If you show up with a gorgeous flower in a garden of pretty flowers, it's a lot more credible and a lot more distinguishable at the same time. So I take the Akero number to some degree as a sense of optimism about drug development in general, not just for that one product. And if that's the case, then energy will start to mount pretty dramatically.
The class of drugs, and I would hope we'll find some time to discuss this in a future podcast. You mentioned that we'll have an episode potentially on that, is really reviving them. FGF21s is very exciting from a metabolic and hepatologic perspective. And there's not only Akero, there's also other compounds in development. And as such, I think that's really an exciting molecule class. It brings us more to the, of course, intensified treatments with sub-Q and application issues, but it will help us to focus potentially on the more advanced population.
Jörn, one of the exciting things, right, is that we're looking at 3 pretty good trials for 3 very different modes of action. The Altimmune numbers are extremely encouraging, and those are triple agonists. That's a triple agonist or dual agonist. They work in very different ways. And then if you take the Poxel result and you add that to what we see from lanifibranor, you see that PPAR is being a way to go also. And all of a sudden, we've got 3 different mode of action pathways without even thinking about FXR. So that would make 4, I guess, with obeticholic acid. You have 4 different mode of action pathways that seem capable of making a contribution. So ideas like combination drug therapy, matching the right drug to the right patient, all those things become realistic and promising. That, I think, is far more than anybody would have hoped for 6 months ago. Yes, no, maybe so. Jörn is smiling, Louise is nodding. Either one of you jump in.
I think you're right. We're already behind the curve because those drugs are going to be approved in a timeline in, say, the next 18 months to 2.5 years, maybe 3 years. Probably at least 1, if not 2 of them. The trouble is, we won't have identified those patients by then who are going to be eligible for their drugs because, as you alluded to earlier, by teaching people early, you find the right patient. We've not even started to implement the pathways for locating these patients for these expensive drugs. So when they're approved, we don't have the patients identified who have jumped through the hoops, who have met the criteria other than a biopsy. Before somebody pays for a drug, they're going to want a patient to have had X, Y, and Z achieved before. That is just the nature of pathways. We're not starting to educate our nursing teams. We're not educating the patients. If we look at it, there should be key performance indicators in now as to how many of your patients get to lose weight. There was a very interesting discussion at Dublin, I think, I've seen so many, on bariatric surgery. And the discussion was of defattening the liver before you go to bariatric surgery to reduce the liver size. So therefore, the biopsy taken at bariatric surgery is not reflective of the liver as was in that patient. It is only reflective of the liver at the time. And how does that really equate to the data and the outcomes that we get? So it is that whole scenario of we're not quite there yet. We're not joining the pieces. The foundation is not there to build the structure on. And as we know, and Jörn's commented before, patients fall out of the pathway. If we do not get these foundations right now, and NASH and NAFLD are in a perfect position to really, really be able to nail this foundation foundation of multimorbidity care, how we select patients, what care they need, because we've got reams of data, and they were both discussed again at this meeting on lifestyle outcomes, how we can help with apps, how we can help with diet, which diet works. Any diet works as long as it's the right diet for that patient, although some have better evidence than others. So these things we really, really can be doing. What we don't have is healthcare providers and investors who are prepared to put that foundation in until we do get this expensive drug, which means we don't have the patient portfolio. We're not identifying patients for trials in 2 or 3 years' time because we're so far behind with COVID. So there is a lot of things that we can't do when, excitingly, these drugs get approved. We're so far behind in where we need to be because we're not identifying the processes to select the right patients or to make sure we have the right patient ready to say, right, first wave of drug, this is suitable for you. We suggest Mrs. Smith, Mr. Bloggs, you wait for the second phase because this would be more in keeping because we already have them. We're not there. And that to me is what I take away from some of these meetings. I love the science. I love the data. I love the enthusiasm, but I'm scared at the lack of preparation that we've got in place for being able to approve these drugs.
So Jörn, first of all, Louise, not to disagree, but I want to move back to kind of where the platform was a moment ago. So Jörn, the drugs. You mentioned FGF21. I threw a little broader and said 3 or 4 exciting classes. Is there something particular about FGF21 that makes that class more exciting than others or unique compared to others? Or do you see the view that I took, which is, well, you got these 4 things coming at once collectively, that's more exciting than any individually. Would you land there?
Yeah, it's of course difficult to compare if they're in different development stages of their life. And you've had a press release from a phase 2 result, which is, of course, one thing you got to keep in mind when interpreting that data. But the FGFs have shown beneficial metabolic effects, no adverse lipid profiles, which we've seen with some other drugs. And they've shown some robust impact on fibrosis regression and NASH resolution if you go by these press releases. Now, some of the earlier data was that same way, and it's difficult, again, to play with the numbers that are released in press release. So I'm very much looking forward to the data set being presented, but the numbers read very well. In particular, you do get responses in terms of NASH resolution and fibrosis regression. So a lot of drugs only had one of those endpoints. Now in phase 2, we've seen that once or twice, and that's just going the right direction. I'm seeing, with the incremental data we're seeing, it's more and more robustly hitting those endpoints we've agreed with as surrogates for conditional approval. And I'm just optimistic that the way forward here is going to be met by one of them. And the other thing, I've been thinking about a lot, the AASLD late-breaking deadline has passed 10 days ago or so. And I think some of the very exciting data has already been put into the system and won't take much longer to actually be presented. So that's also something I'm very much looking forward to because AASLD is not that far advanced and the late-breaking session should be very exciting this year.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. I've heard comment that it's conceivable that you could see as many 3, 4, 5 late breakers at AASLD if we had the bandwidth that would wind up being oral presentations about compelling later stage data for different kinds of NASH drugs. Now, I don't know if that's going to happen, but I've heard that that's a possibility, and that would be amazing. So, crystal ball this. Assume that the data, Jörn, from AASLD is as robust on the drugs as we're hoping it might be. Put on your public policy hat, go back to Barcelona, and tell me what changes in the clinical care pathway discussion or the globalization discussion when the drugs become more real.
I think a bottleneck is going to be the prescribers. Who has the knowledge or who has the willingness to prescribe these drugs that are new? There's no approved previously, and you need to interpret the test in a way that you're certain that you prescribe in label. So we need a lot of people that are really dealing with that. It's not going to be an endocrinologist prescribing a drug that's newly approved with a high price tag to it. I think a bottleneck in those patient care pathways is going to be the prescribers at the beginning. Then rolling this out, building real-world data, phase 4 observational studies, we'll get more and more information. That's what we've seen with example for Hep C, where in the beginning there was a certain, this is new, how do I deal with this? What is the right patient? Well, we only want to select the ones that are advanced and have certain comorbidities potentially, and those aspects will have to be dealt with in the referral pathways. On the other hand, I think hepatologists are ready. We've been there before. more, and we can educate a large group of gastros that might support in treating these patients. So the patient pathways is going to be empowerment of prescribers then.
I've said previously in this episode, it's going to come down to the payers, and they're going to say who can prescribe what. And so there will be restrictions on who's going to be able to prescribe, not dissimilar to hepatitis C.
So that was where I was going to go, which is I'm wondering whether the bottleneck winds up being the prescribers or the payers. And to some degree, that will vary by country, because in the U.S., you can promote the day you get prescribed, even if you don't have payer approval yet. There are other places where it makes no sense to promote or educate until you have payer approval. So I don't know exactly how that two-step is going to go, but I think the payers will be a huge bottleneck. If you think about it, payers tend not to invest in drugs. They like drugs that see a problem, hit a problem, fix a problem, right? Even Hep C, where it was clear that when you got to the DAs, they were amazingly effective, and that over a 10, 20-year period, they would save the health system money. The health system couldn't afford the initial investment to save all the money they could save, which is part of how we got into genotyping and staging and all that stuff, because you needed to figure out which patients you're going to treat first. In NASH, where morbidity and mortality will be multi-system, cardiovascular being more important even than liver in some ways, and where the time horizons are vast, I think the payers might really be a challenge here.
Agree, and I think that's where pushback is going to be. The health system I'm operating in, if it's approved, the payer has to accept it, but the hurdles are then high, and they're threatening with limitations or how to avoid prescribing the drug. I agree that the patient pathways will have to deal with that. We'll have to identify the right patients and talk with the payers and involve them in this discussion. It's not an easy shot.
No, I think not, although it's a vitally important one. So one of the questions I would ask is, who are the players that have the ability to make it go better, faster, smoother? And I ask you in part because of the initiative that you and Jeff have undertaken, and because I now know you're part of these kinds of discussions in lots of different places. Are folks organizing right now in any meaningful way to get support for the drugs, or is that way out of the bounds of the pathway discussions?
I think there's a general perception that drugs will become available. They're not really advanced at this point, and I would say it's still being waited for. So I'm not sure we're ready to have them enter the system yet.
We're not ready to implement them, and unless we start implementing them, the process now and the foundations, because a lot of the foundations are used across the multimorbidity spectrum. And I was looking at a report today that was, and I just wondered, is this where payers come from? Do they believe the figures that we quote, 25% of the global population, or do they just think that, it can't possibly be true because we've never heard of liver disease before, we've never heard of those problems. If it wasn't alcohol, it's not, or viral hepatitis, it's really not on our agenda. But I was looking at the economic impact overweight and obesity 2020 and 2060, which is a second edition. It's based on figures from 161 countries, and it is an obesity federation, so highly experienced in what they're doing. Now, they are predicting that 1 in 5 women and 1 in 7 men will have a BMI of over 30 by 2030, and that by 2060, nearly every country in the world that's developed will be spending 3% of its GDP on the effects of obesity now and outcomes, but also the societal impact. So that does include things like NAFLD, I suspect, and working out how much time patients are in hospital, but also the impact on workforce. And we already know that NAFLD and liver, particularly as a spectrum, is the second leading cause of working lives lost in Europe. So does it sit with purely healthcare, or does it sit with workforce planning and industry? Because that's your workforce that is becoming sicker. The real figures that are frightening is that US by 2060, 91% of the population, including children, is expected to be overweight. That's 91% of the entire American population by 2060. But other countries that can't cope with it, with lower middle income countries. And these figures are absolutely frightening. 3% of our GDP, but their GDP requirements will be 12 to 15 times what they're currently spending because of societal changes. So are drugs our cheapest way out, or is it setting the framework now and the baseline to avoid, where we can, these issues? So making sure that people are aware, are educated, that we're targeting our workforce in healthcare to be able to pick up and help BMI, weight loss, and target that, because a lot of this is ingrained in our culture from birth. So the more I see and the more I hear at the meetings about these figures, and Aran Sunyal was right, and that was Paris Nash, when he said what we've got is currently a failing of healthcare to identify patients, so therefore that sickness on the spectrum spectrum in all of these diseases is key, but getting the foundation or the pillars of care for fatty liver disease and multimorbidity management is something we can be doing now. We do have the knowledge, we do have the technology, and we have the workforce to be able to do it if we reconfigure it in a more patient-centric way, I suppose, and break down those silos. So I think it's frightening on all aspects, and it is only getting bigger from all societies. Obesity, endocrinology, alcohol, everything is saying that these figures are going up. But it is the children that are children today that may not get to see life expectancy as long as I've got or we've got as a whole. That frightens me more than anything. So we do need to change.
That was a pretty complete statement, Louise. And just quickly from my view, I think you're dead right in saying we got to invest at so many levels, and drugs can only be a very small spectrum of that. And there is a lot of societal investment that we should do for this disease as part of metabolic health.
First of all, we're in violent agreement on how important and good it would be to get this right. That said, I'm looking at the political courage of leaders, or the courage of political leaders to tackle things that are difficult and require individuals to take responsibility on themselves. And to the degree that it's going to be on the political systems to invest to make this happen, I lack confidence, for the most part, that the political structures are capable of doing that. And let me frame that differently. What can you envisage happening in the next 6 to 12 months that will be a positive statement on whether we have the political or social will and capital to do this, or possibly a negative statement, something we should need to be looking at on that issue?
6 to 12 months is a very short timeline for anybody to make any changes. Gosh, it used to take me a year to get a business case through and at least 2 service managers just for each thing that we wanted to do in healthcare, let alone in politics. I don't know where it's going to come from, but if you say that by 2060 that we in the United Kingdom will be spending more on obesity outcomes than we spend on our defence budget, we really have to look at different ways. But for me, it's very difficult. People are never in a job long enough. We have a 1-year cycle for finances. Structural changes have to happen at way higher levels than frontline delivery of care is often excellent. It's the processes behind. And it's a very difficult thing to get right. And I can't see much triggering in the next 6 to 12 months to alter that, short of another pandemic that picks the same population that we're still not looking at to improve their health outcomes.
This is almost a political question, much bigger than we usually answer in this podcast. I would think that the power of information and education is something that's needed here. We got to invest in educating about metabolic health, about self-made decisions, about people being able to afford certain lifestyle choices that are more healthier than others. I think that's something. There's a very interesting concept we developed in the arena of public health the other day, looking at a urban green space index where you live in an urban area where you feel safer, you go out to exercise, you grow up metabolically more healthy compared to a environment where there's less green, more pollution. And it could be the pollution, or it's just you don't go out and exercise as much. So I think at many levels societies can try to improve that. I agree it's a little troublesome times where there's a lot of economic crisis looming over us, so the investment in these healthy decisions is tough. On the other hand, I think we're so I'm still optimistic that mankind looks not frightful but open-minded to education and empowerment, that this will eventually help us overcome all crisis.
Okay, let's step back away from that piece of the crisis then and over towards the tool. So one of the things that we wound up talking about in the last episode that both of you, Ms. Mazen, brought up this idea that we've had occasionally on this podcast recently about combo. The idea that it's going to be a combination of diagnostics to tell us who to treat how, and then a combination of drugs used to treat them. I'm going to raise questions about two halves of combo. First of all, on the diagnostics half, Jörn, it feels to me that NAFLD is very much an initiative pointed in that direction and not the only one. But so what do you see from NAFLD and Litmus and Nimble and the others in terms of an effort to move us along the stream towards, first of all, an NIT future, and second, even better, a combo NIT future?
Yeah, I think the concept of combo speaks to not a single biomarker being good enough to make a final diagnosis. If we're talking about referral pathways, that might not need an immediate combo. You need a first step and then additional sequential testings, as discussed at the beginning of this session here. The clear advantage that we're going to see from the consortium NAFLD has that at its heart, but also Nimble, Goldmine, and Litmus, that will have biomarkers that are more robustly linked to outcome, which might enable or promote drug development down the line if we have one biomarker that was validated prospectively. But it will also also inform us if we have a drug approved based on conditional approval, which biomarker to be used and which setting. So I think clearly here these consortia are the way forward to leave liver histology, and I can see liver histology in a label of an approved drug in the future, based also on the work that's been generated here.
Yeah, I agree with Jörn on that. The data, if we would nail our NIT litmus gold mine, nimble. With all of the non-invasive technologies, the data outstrips, if you put it all together, any biopsy data. So if we can use the strength of all of those together to look at the outcomes, then it has to be a way forward in getting drugs approved for market, but also their implementation, because they suit patients. And I agree with Jörn, I cannot see any drug being approved with a life-threatening test. It's just not applicable. It's just not appropriate. And use for trial, absolutely. But actually going forward in the real world, I think there is overwhelming data that we can tie most of these NITs serially or sequentially to the outcomes that we want. That's the advantage of now having the non-invasive space developing hand over fist, really.
We're rolling towards the bottom of the hour. There are a couple of other things that are going to happen in the next 6 months to a year that are worth, I think, commenting on at least briefly. Any expectations from the nomenclature conference and process?
The nomenclature conference is a moving target. I do see the split between the hemispheres, if you'd like. So with Asia making strong moves forwards towards the concept of metabolic dysfunction-associated fatty liver disease. But I do really like the consensus process where there is broad stakeholder involvement, discussion, and the aim to come up with something new that will help us both from stigma, from difficulties in identifying the disease, from many layers that have made this disease so complex, from moving away from a negative definition, from a histology-based definition to the future. I'm not sure the name is out there yet, but the academic discussion is good. I'm a little afraid that there is going to be two strong oppositions, two parties opposing each other, or two teams, if you'd like. I think we got to keep in the academic debate around this and let the data speak to itself, and then, of course, listen to patients and associated healthcare professionals what they think.
Quentin did a paper on a presentation on this in Dublin as part of the nomenclature session, where I think he made an important point, Jörn, that's in a slightly different direction than yours. If we let the data speak to itself, we might get to one place. But he was talking about if we were to change the definition of the disease, not the name, but the definition, then how much work do you have to throw out? That's been done, because the clinical trial work, the people who are strongly advocating changing the definition poo-poo that. But by the way, they tend not to be Americans. And the reason is that most of the aggressive drug development work that's done or funded in the States. And we all understand how the FDA plays. I thought Frank Anania pretty much made the point in Dublin that was a risk. Immediately after that, one of the major advocates of metabolic was a friend of mine, totally poo-pooed. He said, that isn't going to be a problem. I said, why don't you think so? He said, because it never is. And I said, well, there is no never. All you have in liver right now on this is PBC. And there we changed the name, but we didn't really change what we were evaluating in the trials. So, Jörn, I guess my question to you, following up on yours, is do you see an outcome that has the potential to slow or imperil drug and diagnostic development? Or do you believe at the end of the day that will be the line that nobody dares cross?
We do not want to give up on the data and knowledge that's been generated. I think that's an important point. We do not want to give up on advances in drug development sphere. And the drugs that are going to be approved are not going to be approved for metabolic dysfunction-associated fatty liver disease, but for steatohepatitis with fibrosis based on liver histology as a surrogate or liver histology in outcomes. There is a very clear difference here in terms of drug approval pathways. And I agree this is not going to be changed. And the change in definition is not going to affect that, because the people we enrolled in trials are not, you could change the nomenclature, but the way patients got into a trial is clearly defined, and that has to be kept consistently so for the drug development pathway. So I agree we should avoid a discussion where we say, well, everything is different, all the patients are different, everything we've done doesn't count because now it's a new disease. There's a certain risk here, but I don't see the field going there.
So what other developments do we see in the next few months? We talked about some drug stuff, some T stuff, some clinical pathways issues, some policy issues. Where else do we think events might transpire over the next 6-12 months? Where if we record the same episode next year at this time, we look really smart or stupid, take your pick.
So I think we're going to be taking less about significant fibrosis, F2 and NASH as a druggable target. I think we'll focus more on the F3 compensated F4 outcome trials in patients with F4, how to risk stratify compensated cirrhosis, how to identify them because they have normal labs. We don't know they're out there yet. FIB4 might identify some of them, but that's not the final answer to get a compensated cirrhotic trial. We'll just address the more advanced disease population for two reasons. One, there's the biggest unmet need. There might be different in terms of how they respond to certain MOAs. If there's no fat in the liver, can you then use a drug that defattens the liver and get a benefit out of it for the patient? And the second aspect is the whole dynamic of the disease changes here. You get some stiffening with changes in vasculature, portal hypertension, even at a subclinical level. There's so many more aspects to that I think we're just starting to understand also in terms of biomarkers. The field will have its focus on that more advanced patient population is my guess.
I suppose I can jump back to where we started. We may well see pockets of endocrinology starting to drive a little bit more education, a little bit more case finding within their populations. We comment, and Jörn's already commented tonight, it's about education. If we can get the education in, we need to squeeze it from both ends. We need to find the cases we can turn around to prevent NASH and get their lifestyle and they're managed better. But it's about awareness. If you don't know you could have a disease, you're not going to do anything about it. One of the key steps for me is that increasing of knowledge of people who generally, the lifestyle side, getting awareness. If you can avoid being a patient at all costs, then it's something that you might want to do, particularly if it's in the family line, if you can avoid type 2 diabetes. So awareness for me is key, but that's going to start with the education. So I'd like to be seeing more awareness. I'd like to be seeing more early case finding and trying to change where some of the perspective. We will always stay around liver-related outcomes because we are hepatology. And that's where the key is for us, the F3 fibrosis, the F4s, the liver cancer. We do need to be looking to locate a lot more of that population. What is it Stephen says? Is the juice worth the squeeze? Well, we need to start squeezing from both ends to find the populations that count most and at highest risk currently.
At the risk of totally torturing a pun, it sounds like a juicy prospect to me to do that. I think that's a lot, actually. With that, closing question. The single thing you would most like to see in the next year that feels like it might realistically happen? I
would like to hope that NICE will get closer to approving FibroScan for routine care. But am I overly hopeful while it stays bracketed specifically in just kilopascals rather than the all-round? And I think unless we change that, we are well behind future guideline changes because we're behind everybody else. We've recently had the Basel guidelines come out for quality for NAFLD and NASH, which talk about access to non-invasive technologies. So without NICE approving that, that's not going to happen. It'll still be blood tests and other mechanisms, and we're back to square one. We get processes that we can't implement because we don't get the right processes implemented.
I got to talk about drug approvals because I think we're going to see positive phase 3 data emerging. The whole momentum, the discussions with the regulators is going to be at the heart of, getting an FDA-approved drug. I feel we're so close in closing on that first approved drug. So that's something for me very exciting because it's going to then, as we've discussed numerous times, change the math and the dynamics and provide us with more opportunities to serve these patients and provide liver health.
I agree with you. And my optimistic for the next 12 months is that we get 2 drugs. Because if we do, particularly given the 2 drugs we might get in the next 12 months, first of all, I've said this on the podcast and kind of in the first speech I ever gave to NASH-TAG in 2019, a rule of pharmaceutical marketing is the first one is whether and the second one is which. So when you have 2 drugs, the discussion changes from do I treat with a drug to which drug do I treat with, and that amplifies market growth and spending, number one. Number 2 is if we get 2 drugs and one of them is profoundly antifibrotic and the other one has defatting effects, then in fact we're going to wind up taking a look at 2 different patient populations at the same time, which will really speed the education process. So the realistic thing I think might happen is that we get both of them. I'm not sure it will happen. This isn't what I do for a living, but if we do, I believe it will have impact that will be really dramatic, really dramatic. So with that, let me bid you folks adieu. Next week, we will be back with Stephen and Mazen and maybe one more guest talking about some of these amazing drug trials that we've been promising to talk about today. In 2 weeks, we'll be back talking about the decision that NICE is coming to, at least for now, on primary care and fibrosis. My guess is that in 3 or 4 weeks, we'll be back with our 100,000 download anniversary episode, but I'll let you know more about that next week when I know how close we are to it. And until then, everybody just have a great week. Jörn, continue to heal. Louise, good luck to Liverpool on Saturday. And that's because we may need luck, particularly if Hugo Lloris was hurt, as I heard he was last week. And to everybody else, stay safe and surf on. I'll be back with Business Report in a couple of minutes. Say goodbye now. Bye-bye.
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 And now for the Season 3, Episode 47 Business Report.
Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava, glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes, and the war drags on.
I suspect everyone will be staying local for a few weeks.
The last 3 weeks have seen Paris-NASH, the NAFLD Summit, ESD in Stockholm, the importance of which Jörn just discussed, the British Liver Meeting, ALA, which is the Latin and South American meeting, lots and lots of far-flung meetings all around the globe. Now, our team is back at our respective homes for much of October, before AASLD in early November and the rest of the year push.
We have some fantastic episodes ahead.
Next week, Stephen Harrison and Mazen Noureddin will join us to discuss a recent spate of exciting press releases and reports on clinical trials. We touched on some of this during today's episode, but next week will be dedicated to the reasons so many of us are increasingly hopeful of a drug approval or two within the next several months or year at the outside. The following week, we will discuss the results of the NICE meeting tomorrow on VCTE, FibroScan, reimbursement in the community. Toward the end of the month, we'll have our AASLD preview episode and an episode I'll discuss in a minute. November has AASLD coverage, and what will become a new tradition here, an episode on diet and NAFLD that we will post the day before U.S. Thanksgiving. It will have a new guest. If you've never heard Shira Zelbersagi speak, you're in for a real treat. She's fantastic. December has the Mosaic Conference, the NASH-TAG preview, and our year-end wrap-ups, and we have a couple of more surprises I can't announce quite yet.
This week, we have 2 big stories regarding downloads.
Last week will have turned out to be the 3rd or 4th biggest download episode in the history of NASH Tsunami, but I have 2 bigger download stories this week. Much bigger and more exciting than that. The first, sometime this coming month of October, NASH Tsunami will go over 100,000 Buzzsprout downloads. That's a big number. We will be celebrating this rather exceptional event a week or 2 before AASLD. Keep your ears and eye open for dates and details. Also, our Rising Tide series about NAFLD and NASH in patients with type 2 diabetes and obesity has surpassed 1,200 unique identifiers in its first 3 episodes. That might not sound like a big deal, but we do not promote this episode through the podcast distributors, which makes it far more challenging to build an audience. That said, even with the podcast distributors, we did not achieve 1,200 unique identifiers for NASH Tsunami until episode 6, so we're excited at this start.
This week's Vault episode looks at a prediction from last year.
This week, we are replaying Conversation 47.1 from Season 2, one of 3 episodes we ran roughly a year ago asking different patient and physician key opinion leaders to select what they considered the most important stories of the summer. This conversation with Ian Rowe, Louise, and me focuses on the then recent approval of the ELF test by FDA. As usual with Ian, the conversation comes from a different but extremely thoughtful and provocative perspective. It touches on some of the NIT questions and advocacy arguments you hear today and will for perhaps years to come. I think it's 20 minutes well spent. And with that, I'm off. Thanks to the crew, Jake, Magic Mike, Eric, Steve, for working through a somewhat challenging week with me taking time off for the Jewish New Year. And to Jörn and Louise for doing an episode where you have to put your predictions where your listeners could go back and learn how well you did. It's kind of gutsball. And as always, thanks to you, the listeners I just mentioned, for making this such a worthwhile labor to pursue. We'll be back next week with Stephen and Mazen discussing exciting news about drug development. Until then, stay safe, surf on, and we'll see you on the podcast. Bye-bye now.
Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to surfingnash.com, and we will answer on the podcast or the website.